very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that this House has considered the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Mr. Deputy Speaker, first of all, I want to begin by thanking every member of the Backbench Business Committee for granting this important debate, as well as all those members who indicated their support for it. Every year, on the 21st of March, the UN marks the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination through a series of worldwide events. This is because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 21st March was the date of the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in 1960, when police opened fire and killed 69 people at a peaceful demonstration against the apartheid past laws. The day was proclaimed 6 years later through a United Nations resolution, Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, adopted on 26 October 1966. While the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination itself was a few weeks ago, now I am delighted that the House is able to formally mark it with a debate in this chamber. As a Muslim MP and a proud advocate of tolerance, peace and integration, the issue is close to my heart. As the first ever Muslim Mayor of Warrington and MP for Warrington South, I have always understood the value of embracing difference and bringing communities together. Almost 96% Warrington's inhabitants are white, but I have never been made to feel like an outsider. The people of Warrington have always made me a welcome part of their community, ever since I came to live there with my family over 20 years ago. I have been proud to call Warrington my home ever since. Sadly, we know that not all ethnic minorities are as fortunate as I have been to live in such a hospitable, tolerant environment. If all communities were as welcoming as Warrington, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there would be no need for us to have this debate today. As it is, many forms of racism and discrimination are on the rise. Disturbing, violent trends of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have become more and more frequent. I have already mentioned the horrendous attack on the Muslim community in New Zealand last month. A Jewish place of worship in Pittsburgh was subject to a similar attack 5 months earlier, the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in US history. Both killers were clear in their hatred of both Jews and Muslims. Both subscribed to the far-right Great Replacement theory, which casts Muslims and other minorities as invaders of Western societies and a threat to white Christian majorities. It seems appropriate, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the specific theme to mark this year's UN International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is mitigating and countering rising nationalist populism and extreme supremacist ideologies. In the wake of these horrific far-right attacks, I am sure members will agree that there could not be a timelier theme for this year. Because these are not just sporadic attacks in far-flung corners of the world, they represent part of a wider trend, and their impact has been felt much closer to home. Just 2 weeks ago, the trial of a neo-Nazi who had plotted to kill a member of this House was concluded. The plotter had been a member of the fascist National Action Group. During that trial, the prosecution told the court that National Action had engaged in a campaign of racist, anti-Semitic and homophobic propaganda through which it sought to stir up a violent race war against ethnic minorities and others it perceived as race traitors. I want to echo the sentiments of the Speaker last week in commending the courage and integrity of my right honourable friend, the member for West Lancashire West, faced with this vile hatred. She has demonstrated that members of this House will not be cowed by a violent and hateful creed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the face of such vile hatred, it is also too easy to give in to despair. But I will recall the words of Joe Cox, who on these benches insisted that we are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us. Her words, and indeed her life, serve as an inspiration for us all. And we saw Joe's ethos in action even in the immediate aftermath of both the Christchurch and Pittsburgh shootings. Muslim groups raised more than $200,000 for bereaved families at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh is now raising money for the victims of the New Zealand mosque attacks. I cannot think of a more fitting illustration of Joe's message, which is diverse communities coming together to reject racism, bigotry, and hatred. In my own constituency, Mr. Deputy Speaker, local people of all faiths and backgrounds also come together to commemorate the victims of the Christchurch shootings in a local mosque. I am sure many members can recount similar initiatives which took place in their constituencies, countless examples of communities coming together to reject evil and hatred. It is a reminder, even in the darkest of moments, that if we come together to promote peace, tolerance, and mutual understanding, bigotry will never prevail. Mr. Deputy Speaker, if we are to counter this threat, we must also seek to understand its origins and the conditions which allow it to flourish. For there can be no doubt that white nationalist far-right violence is firmly on the rise. In the US in 2018, every single one of the 50 extremist-related murders were linked to the far right. According to the Anti-Defamation League, in the UK between 2017 and 2018, the number of white suspects arrested for terror offences outstripped those of any other ethnic group, the first time in more than a decade. And in Germany, official figures suggest that 9 out of 10 anti-Semitic crimes in 2017 were carried out by members of far-right or neo-Nazi groups. How are we to make sense of this phenomenon? The UN produced 2 reports in August 2018, which investigated on a global scale contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related tolerance. The report argued that the new forms of media were partly responsible for the rise in nationalist populism, describing how they aided or amplified the influence of nationalist populism. One study has suggested that American white nationalist movements saw their Twitter followers grow by more than 600% between 2012 and 2016. These non-traditional media platforms have been used to revive fascist ideas thought to have been consigned to history. We need to look again at the responsibility of large technology companies and how these platforms are regulated. Given the size of platforms such as YouTube and Facebook, they have an obligation to ensure that hatred, bigotry, and misinformation, I emphasize, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that misinformation is the key and is not allowed to flourish on their watch. In recent years, we have seen the rise of far-right social media personalities who now have the ability to reach unprecedented numbers of people online. These individuals are not only allowed to peddle their hatred to hate audiences, they are also able to profit from doing so. Mr. Deputy Speaker, traditional forms of media have also been complicit in fueling these racist narratives. During the height of the refugee crisis, if I remind the members, in 2015, at the very moment that African men, women, children were drowning in the Mediterranean, the Sun newspaper published a column describing these people as, I quote, cockroaches. Shocking, absolutely disgusting. From a national newspaper, this is absolutely disgusting. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, the columnist went on to argue that what we need are gunships, sending these boats back to their own country. These were desperate people risking their lives and often their children's lives to flee a desperate conflict. Nobody wants to leave their country unless they are desperate. And they were desperate because of the conflict, because of the wars, and because of the input from the world. What kind of cruel, inhuman response is it to suggest meeting them with gunships? These comments were denounced by the UN's human rights chief as akin to anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda. Indeed, this dehumanizing rhetoric poisons public debate. For too long, ethnic minorities have been scapegoated in our national press. The media have an indispensable role in our democracy, but this comes with great public responsibility. Racism in the workplace also continues to be a major problem in the UK. A recent survey by Trade Union Prospect found that nearly half of ethnic minority workers had witnessed racism in their workplace, with a quarter of black and ethnic minority employees reporting that they had been racially abused. And just this weekend, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 4 separate reported instances of alleged racial abuse before, during and after Premier League and Football League matches appeared to emphasize a problem highlighted during the week by England international Danny Rose. Tragically, in 2019, Rose was forced to admit that he can't wait to see the back of football because he is so disgusted by the racism that blights the game. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I commend the example of high-profile individuals like Danny Rose and Raheem Sterling for speaking out and taking a stand against this vile abuse. But it is not good enough for us to simply wring our hands whenever this issue is raised and depend on the courage of a vocal few. I give way.
Thank you. Can I congratulate my honourable friend for actually securing this debate? And I do apologise that I was late arriving to this debate, but you've touched on such an important point where we've seen some of our sportsmen, particularly our young black British sportsmen, having to undergo racial abuse while they are playing for their country, England, proudly. And does he agree with me that they have expressed such courage and dignity in speaking out against the racism that they endured, the racism that, frankly, we thought was actually backing our history, but actually is still present and remnant within the game of football today?
Yeah, I thank the honourable friend for her intervention, and she is absolutely right, and I totally agree, because there is no need for any sort of racism in any society, and especially in the sports. It's unbelievable. So I move on with the speech. So we need to systematically eradicate all forms of racist abuse from public life. There should be an absolute zero tolerance policy towards it. Yet governing bodies like UEFA dole out minor fines and partial stadium closures when teams are subject to racist abuse. It is nowhere near good enough. And finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to encourage in terms of our young people and racism in our young people. So I want to turn to the pivotal role young people play in defeating new forms of racism. Ever since my involvement in politics, I have always been inspired by the example of young people seeking to make the world a better place to live. We have seen recently the climate change protests conducted by young people all over the world, teaching us the importance of tackling climate change for future generations. But it is young people who are also at the front line and the receiving end of much of this new and pernicious rise in racism, particularly online. And many young people are adopting extreme and racist views as a result of the content they see online day in, day out. We can do more to combat this in our schools. Young people must be better equipped to identify new forms of misinformation and bigotry if we are to prevent these poisonous ideas from taking hold of future generations. The fight against bigotry and racism begins in the classroom. This is one of the many reasons why our current underfunding of schools is a national scandal. How can we expect future generations to build hard-won victories against racism and intolerance if we starve their schools of funding and resources? In conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would say to far-right racists, ethnic minorities are not going anywhere. We deserve to live, work and raise our families in peace in our own country. The fight against racism and all forms of discrimination is a mainstay of peace and social cohesion, especially in our increasingly diverse society. With this in mind, I hope that the government commits to marking this day each year so we are able to celebrate our diversity and remember those who have committed their lives to fighting racism for a better future. Thank you.
Faisal Rashid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased that we have had the opportunity to have this debate. It is heartening to see members from both sides of the House joining in recommitting Parliament to the fight against racism. And I'm thankful for every member who spoke or made any interventions in this debate. I also thank the Minister for her contributions and for reiterating the government's commitment to fighting racism. However, I'm a little bit confused as to why the government felt this issue was within the remit of the Foreign Office. Surely this is a matter for the Home Office. But anyway, finally, I would add that we need to remember our voices and contributions matter. If our institutions and policies are not doing enough to stem the tide of a resurgent racism, we need to end complacency. And if we can imagine and carry a better world in our hearts, let's keep fight for it. And let's eliminate racism from our society forever.